like with their many years of working on the field, their learnings also guided us in ensuring that no harm was caused to our participants. So basically, like to conclude, I would say that throughout our study, we engaged with reflexive methodology, and we took into account both how we affected the research and how the research affected us, and we course corrected wherever it was needed. So both reflection in action and reflection on action was something that we thought of throughout our presentation. So overall, conducting research online or offline had both its merits, and the fact that we got the opportunity to go back to the field after having the conversation online also allowed us to see the merits that both the modes in itself have. And that's it. Thank you.
For this contribution, I think there are very interesting things which you in your
you are breaking up again, and so maybe you'll have to rejoin. And in the meantime, I'll just say maybe we have time for like 2 questions at this point. If we have time, we will put into the discussion session. So if anyone, I'll first open up the floor for any questions from the audience. And also to say thank you so much to both Priya and Vikas. It is a super interesting presentation, which kind of lays down in detail about the processes that you went in. Like, it says out loud many of the things we take for granted while doing digital ethnography, which I have found very interesting at this. So as I was just telling Raktin, that we have time to maybe take 2 questions right now. And if not, if anyone has anything to say from the audience, if not, you can go ahead with yours right now.
Yeah, the first, I think it was quite an interesting contribution. So thanks for that. I have a very short question. You have highlighted about the unequal power relation which exists between you all doing this research, where it was funded by a Global North institution, where Global South scholars were engaging, and who were also your participants. So I was kind of, I would like to know a little bit more on when you highlighted, like, we always kind of treated Global South context as an extraction of data. So how you navigate that ethically, and how it was kind of minimized. I would not say we can completely avoid that, but how you kind of minimize that while doing this research. Any more questions from the panel members?
Maybe Priya can go ahead, or anyone from the team can go ahead and answer this.
Sure. So I'll start, and Vikas, like, feel free to jump in. So what we did was, like, so the reason why we chose all of the sites that we chose were in the Global South, and that was a conscious decision too, and also a bit about convenience. But it allowed us to, like, our similar history allowed us to ensure that the questions that we asked were not very targeting, because a lot of the our own experiences as researchers in the Global South lets us know that what happens when we ask triggering questions, especially to someone who comes from a patriarchal society or from a society where race or caste is a very big issue, which might not happen if the researcher comes from a surrounding or from a background where these aren't everyday practices. So that learning, like the personal learning we had, was something that allowed us to ensure that we did not ask questions that would trigger in a patriarchal society. Like, there weren't very many gendered experience questions, especially in environments where it's a very patriarchal setting, or there weren't many race or very sharp race or caste related questions that can be taken as a triggering element or in a negative way if our respondents belonged to that particular background.
Can I just to add, and I'll keep it short, being cognizant of time that we have. And I'm sorry for the background sound, but just to Ratan's specific point of minimizing the violence in some senses of the extraction that happens in this sort of contact zone that we find ourselves in of the global north, global south, part of our research design was to actually get around that very conceptualization of neat binaries of global north and global south. Part of that conversation was to actually situate the experiences of our respondents in sort of a fluid networked way, which actually connects global north and the global south. The aspirations of the people are not as localized as we imagine. They are actually quite global in their in scale and in scope. And so our research design particularly spoke to that. The second thing was, part of it is what Priya was mentioning, has to do with the idea of narrative methodology itself, which allowed for meaning making of both stories that were personal and situated in context, but also of stories that emerged in other contexts. So we had participants making sense of stories that were emerging in different sort of contexts, both within their, so it was translocal in that sense. So, so in those ways, we were sort of able to minimize the what Ratan is called the extraction, sorry, or at least the unequal extraction. But I would also say that the very act of this research being situated in the global south allowed us to do it, but also presented its own challenges, because we were speaking to what I think we all sort of consider is, going back to the old conceptualization of how data happens in the south, but theorization happens in the north, right? So we were able to sort of move that a little bit in some senses. And I think that spoke to a larger context within which we were trying to operate. And the COVID moment allowed us in very specific sort of instrumental ways to deliver on that, to be able to sort of, reduce the inequality of interaction in some senses. It posed different other challenges, but that remained one way or the other.
Great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vikas. If there is no further question, probably we can go to Dolph.
Now, yeah, move on. So
Dolph, Rajit, and Kevin's presentation.
And I'll
Thank
be
you.
timing, and I'll request again for you to bring out the main questions you would like to raise, as I'm assuming we have all gone through the main points that you uploaded. Thank you.
Right. Okay, thank you for having us on this panel today. So in the room with me are my sort of co-researchers, Dr. Rajit Lakshman and Kevin Hernandez. So this paper is actually part of a larger research project on displacement, placemaking and well-being, which has been conducted over the last 3 years in 4 countries, India, Finland, Norway, and the UK. As many of us had to pivot, so have we during the pandemic, where our original intention of doing field work was scotched, and we opted for a different way of conducting virtual ethnography around the theme of migrant placemaking in physical and digital spaces and urban well-being. So the basic rationale for this piece of work, and of course I'd like to refer you to our recorded presentation, which gives you a bit more sort of meat on the bone. So I'm rushing through that presentation now. Basically, the rationale of this study is around trying to understand better how displaced populations, including migrant populations who might be voluntarily moving into urban areas, are making new lives. And the COVID moment offered a particular opportunity for us to start interrogating sort of activities in digital spaces, whereas our previous work was particularly focusing on physical placemaking. Placemaking is quite a contested sort of subject or concept, I should say, rather. And in our sort of consortium of researchers, we had sort of architects and social sciences of different sort of backgrounds, including anthropologists and urban studies specialists and development studies scholars, etc. The architectural sort of conceptualization around placemaking is, if I sort of characterize it in a sort of slightly stereotypical manner, is very much one of envisaging sort of how urban spaces should look and designing for that purpose. Whereas we also use that to contrast with a much more bottom-up sort of notion of how particularly vulnerable populations are actually themselves engaging in everyday activities that reshape the spaces and the places in which they live. So our case study here for this paper is the London sort of borough of Southwark, in particular the Elephant and Castle sort of area. And we focus on this because this is a hyper-diverse neighborhood, sort of, which has a particularly large Latino community. And there's a tremendous amount of turnover of people in this area. And this area is also, on the one hand, sort of is having very sort of vulnerable, sort of marginal sort of pockets and neighborhoods and populations, whereas at the same time it's highly centrally located in London, and there's a lot of sort of if you like top-down placemaking activity happening, including by the borough council. So we tried to understand sort of how through a digital ethnography method how people were engaged in placemaking in digital spaces in order to try to draw connections with their activities in physical spaces in the city itself. And that's where we saw our contribution, because we felt there are different sort of literatures that speak sort of to these topics and are quite sort of disconnected. I'll give a bit more sort of examples of that sort of in the recorded presentation. But in the interest of time, let me just skip through here. So our focal point was partially the Elephant and Castle Mall, which was demolished during the pandemic itself, and which was a real community hub for Latino migrants in the city. So I'm hopping over sort of conceptual framework to move to the methodology very briefly. So we created a methodology that tried to interrogate sort of what was happening and how people were talking, how Latino communities themselves were talking about sort of these physical spaces and these sort of neighborhoods. And we therefore sort of developed sort of a new methodology. This work was led sort of by Kevin sort of and Roger sort of in particular, the two of them, trying to understand sort of if we could use Facebook sort of open sort of public pages for analyzing sort of the kinds of discussions that were happening around this topic of placemaking in sort of Southwark Borough, in and around Elephant and Castle Mall by Latino communities. So
sorry to interrupt, but maybe you could wrap up now so we can get into the discussion.
Okay. So we looked sort of across just 1 minute, please. We looked across 3 dimensions of well-being, both the material aspects of well-being, relational well-being elements, and subjective well-being. So including elements of belonging and to the neighborhood. So we'll give you examples in that online presentation. To conclude, sort of, we tried to understand we found sort of that the particular ethnography sort of approach that we used sort of was able to forge these connections between activities in the physical and in digital spaces, and we felt that was a novel sort of contribution that this paper sort of offers. We noticed that particularly everyday placemaking activities are undergirded and enabled by digital placemaking activities, as we've testified in various examples. And therefore, we need to think about digital placemaking as an integral part of the ways in which cities develop, and the ways in which different communities and populations in cities actually interact both on their own account and develop sort of initiative and activities that sort of shape urban spaces, but also that sort of interact with more top-down placemaking positions and sometimes challenge public policy accordingly. So the question really for the group, which in a way is sort of was of course well anticipated by many others, but I thought sort of just an overarching question sort of concerned sort of these larger issues around sort of what are actually opportunities and limitations, strengths, and weaknesses that the diverse set of digital sort of ethnographies that we've heard of today are actually sort of offering and bringing to the table. And there's obviously already a couple of key issues highlighted by the panelists, issues around ethics, issues around sort of the relation between the researcher and the research subjects, sort of both in terms of power, but also in terms potentially in terms of co-designing and jointly conducting research. And there are many other aspects, but I thought that would be a question perhaps we could also chew on a bit more. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dolph. I think there are quite interesting things which this presentation particularly brought together, which is how everyday materiality kind of get juxtaposed in a digital medium. And it was quite fascinating to hear about the Elephant and Castle case study, which I'm also a bit familiar with living in London. So I probably have 2 small questions. One is to look at, we often try to kind of look at digital platforms as kind of neutral medium, which is actually not true, which we all are aware of. So I was kind of interested as these research was focused on migrant communities, particularly Latino communities. How differential power relations and race also kind of put together in those comments, which you kind of did a textual analysis. And the second question, which is also there were a lot of community mobilization which was happening against the gentrification in that area in Southwark as well as within Elephant and Castle. So I was kind of wondering, I'm not sure whether it was part of your research or not. So whether that activism part also kind of came beyond those everyday subjectivities and nuances to find a place where Dominican Republican people can meet, and if someone's son can't speak English, how they can find some resources. So beyond those everyday materiality, whether there were also an effort to community mobilization and activism which happened through this post. Thank you.
Thank you, Raktim. So two really excellent questions. And I would like to invite my colleagues as well to come in, because Kevin in particular has been analyzing the data as much of it is conducted in Spanish, which I'm unfortunately unable to grasp myself really. So the question was around how do power relations and race come in in these platforms themselves? And Kevin, I think you have a very good example around how you anticipated some of the comments being actually underwritten by if you like, racial notions and racial efforts to marginalize some of the contributors on the forum. And we kind of made a methodological move to actually exclude some of those. So Kevin, perhaps you could say a few words about it. And of course, you also know very well, you've made some very interesting observations around community organization. There has indeed been a lot of community organization around both Elephant and Castle and around another Latino hub in London around Seven Sisters. Some of that is happening online, but actually remarkably, some of that we found that it was, in the Facebook group where we were looking, some of that community activism, otherwise really active, seemed to be having a disconnect. But Kevin, can you say a few more words about that
Yeah, so to start off, so my positionality in this is I am a Latino. I am not from the UK though, I'm from New York, and I'm from a Latino community in New York, which is quite similar to that community in Elephant and Castle, where I am from a low-income migrant neighborhood in New York City. And there's a lot of similarities, but then a lot of disconnect, because in New York, we're a much bigger group, so we have a lot more power, in a sense that we have power in numbers. We're probably like a third of the population in the entire city, whereas in London, it's like 9% of that borough, which is quite small. So being a Latino, I kind of anticipated some of the racial and ethnic dynamics that would occur. So I purposely chose not to analyze any groups that also included Spanish people. And why is this? Because in Spain, Latinos also encounter some discrimination. And there's also that colonial relationship between Spain and its former colonies. And I actually saw this pop up at times where I followed some of the posts. So at times there were posts that were like reshared, and they would be from like a Spanish newspaper or Spanish language newspaper. And in those situations, you would see kind of like Spanish people interacting with Latinos. And in some situations, you would see Spanish people having kind of a backlash towards Latinos when they kind of showed that they were some kind of discontent with the mall being demolished. So in one situation, somebody said like, "Oh, they're trying to push us out of this city more and more." And then a Spanish person responded with like, "Oh, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Why should there be a Latino neighborhood? You're in the UK." So I specifically tried to avoid those type of comments, and to ensure that the majority of the posts were coming from Latin people, by only including groups that were specifically tailored to either all Latinos, that only said Latinos in London and that kind of stuff, and only groups from specific nationalities are Latinos. So things like Argentinians, Dominicans, Colombians, so on and so on. And those were the only groups I analyzed, just to avoid that power dynamic. And your other question was about community mobilization. So we did come across some posts where people were trying to mobilize the community. I thought one thing that was interesting to me was that in these posts, there tended to be very little interaction. So like the person would kind of signal that there would be some mobilization, but not many people responded. And I think this has a lot to do with these Facebook groups that we analyze being public. And that probably dissuaded some people from really interacting, because if you're in a very precarious situation and you're in a place where you might not feel as welcome, you might not want to be seen as someone who is mobilizing. So I think we would have probably seen something different if we went into some private Facebook groups, but obviously for ethical concerns, we didn't go into those.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin and Dolph. And our last presentation, which is also a fabulous contribution, which is by Etika. Etika, I think you can go ahead with your contribution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's good to be here, and I hope you've listened to my presentation, which is recorded. I really won't go over the presentation in detail because I'm aware that we're all pressed with time, but I'll just quickly just share some of the key findings, I would say. Let me just, some of the key questions which I had. I hope you can see my presentation. Yeah, so I'll just quickly, I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm Atika Kamal and I'm a lecturer at University of Essex. The study basically draws on some of my current research, which I've been doing in the past related to social cash programs in the context of digital identity platforms and how digital identity platforms are playing a crucial and significant role in targeting, identifying and providing, dispersing social cash benefits to beneficiaries in low-income population groups. So I'll just quickly move on to some of my questions here. So in this study, I've looked at some of the some of the methodological challenges which I came across, and datafication of citizens, is a process which has actually enabled certain actors and has disempowered other actors. And the role of digital identity platforms in this particular context is NADRA. This is a case study of the ESAS welfare program in Pakistan, which has liaisoned with NADRA, which is actually datafying citizens and identifying poor income populations and providing social cash. And during the pandemic, what happened, the government of Pakistan, they were faced with the pressures of providing social cash to low income groups. And they expanded on the existing social care platform and provided social cash assistance to the next tier of 6 million low-income population groups, which comprised of people who were working in the informal economy, and not only women who were basically part of the previous program, which ESAS was targeting earlier under the previous administration. Looking at some of the methodological challenges linked with digital ethnography, because during the pandemic, everything had to be shifted online. I think one of the main challenges which I came across was how digital ethnography, or using online methods, mobile interviews, how the discourse or the narratives were framed around the most powerful political actors. So we had NADRA, which was a technological actor. We had the government, or ESAS social cash program, which were the political actors, and we had citizens who were the social actors. So who did this methodology, this methodology empower? How was sense making biased or shifted around different actors, which in this case was NADRA and the political actors, which were, officials from ESAS poverty program. So over here, we saw that how certain income groups, such as women, were marginalized in accessing social cash. We draw on different conceptual frameworks from Heeks, who I just saw, who was here, and from Azero, which is linked with the data justice framework, looking at instrumental injustice, which became very, very dominant, design injustice, which was dominant. And also, I talk about access injustice here, because digital ethnography disempowered those actors who did not own a mobile phone, or who did not have access to technology, or who were not able to independently voice out their concerns and their perceptions regarding how they benefited from the social cash or not. So those voices I found were really marginalized. And we also find that technology or this form of interrogation reshaped, reconfigured the whole conceptualization of the findings in the study around technology. So how technology as a methodological tool, how does it restructure structural inequalities in a sense of suppressing certain voices and certain voices being heard. It was very, very easy to actually get in touch with the political actors, officials from ESAS. Mobile interviews were conducted with them. But as far as, low-income groups were concerned, specifically women, we found that a lot of women did not own a mobile phone. So there were certain facilitators. Identifying them was a big issue. So we needed someone over there on the ground to identify certain banking agents with whom, their interviews had to be, I would say, facilitated. So we had to call up other people, and women were standing next to those banking agents, and through them, their opinions were basically heard. So in this context, I find that the real notion of ethnography was very, very limited, in which we talk about immersion and understanding people's voices, through their body language, through symbols. That was very, very much limited in this study. So we also noticed how power dynamics also came into play, which other researchers here have also highlighted this, how power has affected the general narrative, which completely shifts when we shift sometimes, to digital methodological tools. So thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you.
I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, there is already a question by Sylvia in the chat. So yeah, we can probably start with that and then followed by Kevin's question.
Should I ask my question from here, or should I'm not entirely sure how it works here. I can briefly ask my question if that's okay. Yeah, thanks everyone for the panel. Thanks, Atika. Amazing work as always. I guess my question is relating to the angle of design injustice. You elaborated on it in the video and briefly mentioned it today. I think my comment is, I think design injustice, so the injustices that are really embedded into NADRA, as I know, my main source on NADRA is your work. So and I really see this design injustices coming across very powerfully. So I would say perhaps for this conversation, it's a good, perhaps it could be a good idea for this conversation and for the journal version of your paper. If you want to elaborate more on where you see the design injustice here and how it plays out. And thank you, fantastic work as always.
Shall I answer this question, or shall I take other questions first? How would you want?
Yeah, maybe Kevin, if you have a question.
Yeah, I think my question will be related anyway. So normally I am more in the ICT4D space. So this is really interesting for me to see your presentation. And my question related to that is in ICT4D, but I think even more just in development in general now, digital inequalities are in the forefront and everybody's speaking about them. So my question is, if it's so, like, I feel like it's almost just the norm to hear about digital inequalities today and age. So what was the rationale behind the design of this program, knowing that digital inequalities were a thing? How did the government kind of rationalize the fact that they were delivering the assistance digitally? Because to anybody in this field, it kind of just seems obvious that that was going to exclude people.
Okay, so shall I start by answering Sylvia's question first? So yes, so the conceptualization of design injustice was linked with, it was basically linked with, how, beneficiaries were, or how citizens were asked to actually go to the different distribution centers and collect cash. So also, it was also linked with that there were liquidity problems, knowing that, cash was being distributed during the pandemic. There was a national lockdown, and there were very, very specific distribution centers which were set up. And because of that, even a lot of public transport was shut down during the pandemic. And so because of that, there was a lot of inconvenience for the citizens and for the beneficiaries to actually travel long distances, especially from rural areas to cities, just to collect cash. Although I think that this could have been done in a more wiser way. I mean, initially when the program was launched, and my work has previously been related to BIS, which has been renamed as the Kafalat program now, where the money was being transferred electronically through banking agents. But again, while it's being transferred through banking agents, the design of the program is such that they're excluding the banking sector from here and giving access to bank accounts for women. So rather than going towards a step which would enhance financial inclusion in the country by being more digital, so these were cash grants which were handed out rather than digital grants, which previously the program had been dispersing, before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, these were not digital grants, but they were cash grants. And again, there were lots of problems associated with the disbursement of cash grants, as I mentioned earlier, which was liquidity. A lot of distribution centers, they ran out of cash, and arranging that cash, was a problem because of transport being shut. Another design-related issue was that, there were lots of big queues because they were given certain time slots to go and collect cash. And of course, there was no social distancing, which was followed at that time, or which was respected, no social distancing rules. And again, they had to verify their identification through thumbprints, through biometric readers. And so that was a big way in which, COVID could have spread a bit more. So again, there were some risks involved in the design of this disbursement system. So I hope this answers your question, Sylvia. And moving on to Kevin's question, which is related with digital inequalities, you're very right that digital inequalities is a big is a big issue these days. I mean, is a big I would say challenge for governments to overcome. And the reason why the program was launched this way was to make it more transparent and make it more efficient. However, it was really not realized that, it would be excluding certain people. And the way they thought it would be made more transparent and more visible would be by using data analytics. And what happened was that NADRA, or in other words, the National Identity Management System, so it was very bottom up in the sense that people were asked to send an SMS message rather than being top down. So people who belong to a certain income group were asked to send a SMS message to a particular number. And that number was received by NADRA. And data analytics were run. The ID number of that particular citizen was checked against different databases. So there was an algorithm, there was a rule-based algorithm which was used, and the person's identification number, or computerized national identification number, was checked through several databases, which included the already existing Kafala database, which had registered previous beneficiaries onto the program. It was checked against the Federal Board of Revenue. It was checked against a passport and immigration database, just to make sure that genuine beneficiaries were registered onto the program and they would be receiving social cash. So while the government, on one hand, they tried to make sure that only the cash was being received by genuine beneficiaries, on the other hand, I think they failed to acknowledge that there would be certain segments in the population who would be disproportionately excluded. As I mentioned, so there was an access data injustice, which was linked with women, transgender groups who did not own a national identity card. And again, also refugees, for example, immigrants, and also people whose thumbprints could not be verified. So in a way, it was made to include genuine beneficiaries. So in order to make it as transparent as possible, but on the other hand, it was disproportionately excluding marginalized communities. So I hope this has answered your question.
Thank you, Atika. I think we are running out of time, and it's a fascinating work, which also reminds me a very similar program in the context of India, which is Aadhaar. And I would like to kind of I was remembering Taringini Sriraman's work on In Pursuit of Proof, where she kind of said like how digital IDs are regressive to urban poor. And I'm just paraphrasing her. She said these are combustible concoction putting into dynamic social identity, which is also, I think, very much applicable in case of Pakistan. So thank you for kind of providing all our contributors for providing such thought-provoking ideas. And there are a few things which, as we are wrapping up this session, we would like to kind of also expand a little bit more when we look at digital ethnography, which I will start with what Vikas was kind of highlighting, how they were trying to kind of destabilize this binary identity of global South and North, which is also kind of important, which I also argue in my work as well. But while we are speaking about global South, also global South is not also a homogeneous category. So there are different racial, caste, and other kind of dynamics which are also associated when an African partner is actually engaging with an Indian partner. So there are different kinds of multiple subjectivities which are kind of shaped within this digital mode. Also, there are politics of listening, politics of intimacy, which we need to be mindful when we look at digital ethnography, because again, this is not kind of a neutral field anymore. It was never a neutral field at all. And as Dar and Ibrahim and others have highlighted, like how digital modes are also kind of helps to sustain certain kind of colonial amnesia through its pervasive nature within our everyday life and materialities. So I'll wrap up here. So probably I'll see you in other panels at DSA. So thank you again for all this contribution, which are, I think, quite rich. And we had a really, really rich discussion and engagement. Probably we had to cut down some of the discussion because of the shortage of time. So thank you once again for all your contribution. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. How do you get me?
Thank you. Thanks, Maktam.
Thanks. Why am I seeing another link here? Is there another, is this linked to this panel as well?
Not to this panel, but if you're going to be participating or joining in for any of the other panels, the next one starts at 1:50. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Have a good day.